Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special webinar this afternoon. This is a series that we started in our research center on rethinking trauma theory through dialogue. We call ourselves the group, the Trauma Studies group, and we have been in conversations for almost a year now with a group of scholars at Rhodes University, at Wits University, UJ Stellenbosch University. You will see some of these people when we come to the Q&A time. Our imagination for this series is to think about what the concept of trauma means for us in South Africa and the continent. We are using South Africa as a starting point to rethink these questions. And today we have a very special guest, someone who has engaged with these questions for some time, Professor Stef, who is a professor of English literature and director of the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative at Ghent University. His research interests lie in 20th century and contemporary literature and culture, memory and trauma studies, post-colonial theory and environmental humanities. His books include Post-Colonial Witnessing, Trauma Out of Bounds, which was named one of Time's Higher Education's books of 2013. Trauma as co-author, and Memory Unbound, Tracing the Dynamics of Memory Studies as co-editor. Professor Krebs has co-edited several special issues, including for the journals Collateral, American Imago, Studies in the Novel, and Criticism. Welcome to you, Stef. We look very much forward to engaging with you this morning. I introduce next Thando Njovane. Dr. Thando Njovane is a lecturer in the Department of Literary Studies in English at Rhodes University, where she teaches early, modern and post-colonial literatures. Dr. Njovane has published scholarship in the areas of childhood, psychoanalysis, trauma, and post-colonial literature and higher education in South Africa. Her research interests include psychoanalysis, memory, modernisms, contested past, feminisms, and existentialism. She is the co-director of the Transcontinental Interdisciplinary African Studies Platform, which she co-founded as well, Finding Africa. Welcome to you, Thando. You are no stranger to us. You've been with us even before lockdown. So we welcome you again. Thank you very much. Thando is going to play the role of respondent, and we'll respond to Manosa before Stef Krebs speaks to us. And finally, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Manosa and Nthunya. Both Manosa and Thando, by the way, are part of our trauma studies group. Manosa is a PhD candidate in the English department at Wits University. His research is entitled Psychoanalysis in South African Literature and Film. He has an interest in South African literature and film, psychoanalysis, and queer theory. Manosa is currently the book reviews editor for the English Academy Review Journal, and he has previously worked as a chief book critic at the City Press. He studied literature, history, and philosophy at Rhodes University. We could think of no one better than Manosa to speak on these questions in conversation with Professor Stef Krebs this afternoon. So thank you very much, Manosa, and I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And Thank you to Prof. Stef Krebs for being here as well, and to everyone that is listening. So now I will start. In his short book, Civilization and its Discontents, published in his late writing in 1930, Freud poses a question of what to do with what we call civilization, a technologically and morally advanced stage, as one might want to say, simplifying, that human reason and achievement has attained. What is most obvious to Freud is that there is a huge disjuncture between what we call civilization, or the march towards it, against the ways in which human subjectivity is formed. While humans might want to assume that such human achievements are a sign of progress, that there is in fact something else, something more sinister to Freud that is occluded from view, which is every human being's propensity to be violent, to be aggressive towards one's neighbor and oneself. For Freud, civilization is always a failed attempt to limit how much we can be aggressive towards each other. Because we know of this unlimited capacity in ourselves, we put in place laws, structures, moral codes, and customs, such as religion, that we hope will inhibit our capacity to be violent. For Freud, such a failure in civilization is already made evident by the fact that such structures and moral codes are in themselves always already exclusionary. We create small communities divided by race, gender, class, and other differences in order to believe in something or in the good, as some might say. Freud writes, however, and I quote, "It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. In other words, love for something can only be possible if there's something else, something outside that one despises that makes love for their group or something possible in the first instance." Even more despairing to Freud is the fact that, as he writes, I quote, "It is clearly not easy for men to give up the satisfaction of this inclination to aggression. They do not feel comfortable without it. In other words, there is an enjoyment, even if often concealed, or at least we would like to think, to the fact that we are aggressive towards each other, as though such aggression were itself a shield against an already always known and anticipated enemy." These are questions that Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, was asking. Professor Stef Krebs has also been asking his own questions. From his 2005 book, Trauma and Ethics in the Novels of Graham Swift, to Postcolonial Witnessing, Trauma Out of Bounds, to co-editing the book, Memory Unbound, tracing the dynamics of memory studies, and co-authoring the critical introduction to trauma studies with Lucy Bond entitled Trauma. The work of Professor Krebs has always been invested with what it means to understand the concept of trauma. What are the histories of such a concept, and in what ways does the concept continue to have significance or lack thereof in how we think about the relation between the violent pasts, our violent pasts, and the present? Is the concept capacious enough to allow us to understand these links? Trauma has historically been understood or defined as a wound to the body. A wound, one might say, that cuts deep and often refuses to heal, often leaving scars in its aftermath. It has a lasting impact on the body, reconfiguring how the body moves and makes sense of the world. Thus, there's a marked difference between the experience of the world prior to a traumatic encounter and post the traumatic experience. The world is no longer the same. The subject needs to rethink how it goes about its world, a world that seemed or was assumed to be known and predictable and now appears to be otherwise. It is after the First and the Second World Wars, as many trauma theorists working from the West tell us, that the concept changed from merely being about a wound to the body expanding into a psychic wound. Similar to the body, we learn the mind also experiences trauma. Its seemingly stable and predictable functions can also change, shattering an individual's mental ability to function as it used to. These are, of course, experiences of war, of colonialism, of sexism, of abuse, and of the current global crisis we are living in. They are experiences that manage to be both wound and psychic at the same time. In the book Trauma, Stef Krebs and Lucy Bond write that, I quote, "Traumatic experiences leave deep scars that can remain unresolved for decades, generations, even centuries. Being bound to the past while struggling to overcome it is no short order," unquote. It is no short order precisely because we never know the impact that traumatic experience will have on us. While we may know its historical experience and the conditions that brought it into being, we never know what we are left with after its occurrence, and what its everyday uncanny manifestations may be. It lasts, as the authors write, for decades, generations, and even centuries. What also often comes up, in fact, I would say is central in Krebs' work, is not only a call for the recognition of trauma, but also an acute critical reflections on its limit or sometimes its abuse. Is trauma always what it seems to be? And what do we make of the ways in which, similar to other aspects of our lives, it is also not immune to being taken advantage of by dominant discourses such as, let's say, neoliberal capitalism, which may have less of an interest in what trauma really is than in what it might in fact gain from the use of trauma. In other words, how it might profit from the use of trauma. Krebs and Bond write that, I quote, "A thriving trauma industry informs our leisure and consumer choices. Dark tourist locations such as concentration camps, battlefields, plantations, and prisons draw millions of visitors each year, and their gift shops boast huge turnovers." At the same time, they write, "Meanwhile, online sales of official and unofficial Black Lives Matter merchandise have helped transform a grassroots movement that campaigns against violence and systemic racism towards Black Americans into a globally recognizable brand." Therefore, the question that they pose is, what are the gains and losses that emanate from such a game, from such a use of trauma within the neoliberal capitalistic time that we live in? What is clear in all of Krebs' work is that trauma is an unstable side as it always refuses closure. They write that, I quote, "Trauma is slippery, blurring the boundaries between mind and body, memory and forgetting, speech and silence. It traverses the internal and the external, the private and the public, the individual and the collective. Trauma is dynamic. Its parameters are endlessly shifting as it moves across disciplines and institutions, ages and cultures." This important book will be of great interest to anyone attempting to get into this field, understand its history, and the current debates that continue to emanate from it. The Nobel Prize winning the Nobel Prize winning writer Nadine Gordimer once wrote that, and I love this quote, I quote, "Your whole life you are really writing one book, which is an attempt to grasp the consciousness of your time and place. A single book written from different stages of your ability. That book, it would seem to me, for Prof. Krebs, is post-colonial witnessing, trauma out of bounds." And here, Prof, I'm not taking you to an early retirement, but just to say that it's a standout, I think, from many people that study your work. It is a book that helps us to understand the link between the theoretical terrain of trauma studies and its link with literary studies. It is a book, in other words, that attempts to make trauma theory speak. With an interest in the literary, the book studies novels from different parts of the world to stretch but also expose the limits of the concept. He explores books by British Caribbean writers, Indian writers, to the South African writer Sindiwe Magona, all in an attempt to investigate the different yet difficult histories of these societies. Each society has a history, and by mere virtue of this, each society, each people has experienced trauma. But is a single concept ever adequate? The book asks us to reflect on this. In post-colonial witnessing, the intention is to move trauma studies away from what Krebs calls its Western cultural obsession and to attempt to see what it is that it might say about different histories, of course, that it has often occluded. He writes, and I quote, "Remarkably, the founding texts of the field largely failed to live up to this promise of cross-cultural ethical engagement. They fail on at least 4 counts. They marginalized or ignored traumatic experiences of non-Western or minority cultures. They tend to take for granted the universal validity of definitions of trauma and recovery that have developed out of the history of Western modernity. They often favor or even prescribe a modernist aesthetic of fragmentation and aporia as uniquely suited to the task of bearing witness to trauma. And they generally disregard the connections between metropolitan and non-Western or minority traumas. Trauma theory's failure to give the sufferings of those belonging to non-Western or minority groups due recognition fits uneasily with the field's ethical aspirations. But lest the reader or the listener be mistaken, the book is not a rejection of the concept of trauma, nor even a call to discard certain literary styles such as modernism in favor of other aesthetic representations. It is rather a call to expand the field, to be alert to the kinds of texts that we valorize and be attuned to the damage this might have in our understanding of trauma from such which might, as the title suggests, be out of bounds with what is accepted. He therefore writes that, and I quote, rather than positing a necessary relation between aesthetic form and political or its ethical effectiveness, I argue that trauma theory should take account of the specific social and historical context in which trauma narratives are produced and received. In the context of South Africa, one thinks of the incisive words by the novelist and academic Cindy Magona, who writes in her essay, It is in the Blood, that, and I quote, it is in the blood. Our bodies are perforated by painful memory, trauma. It is in the blood, in the very cells of our now apartheid deformed bodies, which is why when something triggers a certain memory from the hideous and painful past, often the response is visceral, the outward demonstrable behavior immediate and outstanding to those who lack comprehension of who we are and what dehumanization we've suffered. Our bodies embody the pain of our legal enslavement. What I found most interesting rereading the books in the current climate we live in is the questions that runs throughout the book, that is post-colonial witnessing, of whether the concept of trauma might in fact be enough to make us understand what it is that constitutes the human condition. A traumatic sides, one might ask controversially, as easy to comprehend as historical narratives, the ways in which we write and want to understand history, dominant narratives, make us believe. This was made possible for me in rereading South Africa's first democratic president's books and speeches in trying to understand the manifold crises that South Africa is bedeviled with at the moment as we ironically celebrate Nelson Mandela's month. Not only is the world facing a health crisis that has upended all our lives, but as I speak, there are soldiers all over the streets of South Africa attempting to calm a storm that many have anticipated. A question that we are always asking seems to have come, at least something. Can such an unequal society survive? And if so, for how long? What will have to give to deal with the historical racialized inequalities of the past that seem to be persistent, able to transmogrify swiftly with the changing global political and economic spheres? And what to make of a government similar indeed to other governments, probably from all parts of the world, that seems to be increasingly removed from the everyday needs of the majority, where the struggle for injustice has been turned into a competitive sport for who owns the most expensive suits, as we hear in commissions of inquiries. What kind of trauma does such a society inflict? And why does it continue to be so difficult, if not impossible, for most of us, if not all of us, not to be able to comprehend our aggression towards others when we are not or no longer on the receiving end of material or other kinds of traumas? In his often humorous, if not mocking ways, Nelson Mandela wrote in his retirement speech that he delivered on the 1st of June, 2004 that, and I quote, "I'm turning 84 in a few weeks' time, and that is a longer life than most people are granted. I have the added blessing of being in very good health, at least according to my doctors. I'm confident that nobody present here today will accuse me of selfishness if I ask to spend time while I'm still in good health with my family, my friends, and also with myself." And this is the important part. One of the things that made me long to be back in prison was that I had so little opportunity for reading, thinking, and quiet reflection after my release. I intend, amongst other things, to give myself much more opportunity for such reading and reflection that, as he says, he was only granted when he was in prison. I was struck by Mandela's longing to be back in prison in rereading the speech, because it was not the first time I had heard him articulate such a thought. It is something that he often repeated, ironically, of course, of wanting, as he says, more time to read and to reflect. Undoubtedly, prison for 27 years is a trauma that is incomprehensible. There would be no language sufficient enough to speak to it. This is where language falters. But similar to Prof. Krebs' work that asked us to challenge our perception of trauma, of our reading of history, I also want to pose a similar question in conclusion. What does it mean, taken from Nelson Mandela, to mean a sight, to miss a sight that was traumatic? In what ways do Mandela's reflections challenge, expand, throw out, reinforce the ways in which we have thought about trauma thus far? Living in a health crisis that has taken the lives of millions, caused untold harms to many, what will we make of the fact that for other people, this time, slowed down time, as some call it, was precisely a time that many others in the world longed for, against the pressures of neoliberal, racialized capitalism that seemed to know no bounds? It would therefore seem to me that more than anything else, this time is a question of time. It is a question that Professor Krebs has himself asked, of what we make of the fact that we experience the world and time so differently. In other words, will trauma studies, that is as done time and time again, also have to go back to the drawing board after this time? I thank you.
Thank you so much, Manosa, for that powerful, profound opening statement on Stef's work. I am just bowled over just listening to you, and so timely your work that not just focuses on Stef Krebs, but puts it in context of where we are today. That is really, truly amazing. It's the mind of a thinker, and reminding us about the capacity for reflection, the importance of that, the reading and reflection. Thank you, Manosa, very, very much. Without much further ado, I'm going to invite Thando to respond before Professor Stef Krebs also has his say in response to what will be offered. So Dr. Njovane, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Prof. Krebs and Manosa, for a wonderful presentation. Very thought-provoking and really just taps into the current moment that we're in. In my response, I want to firstly kind of make some observations about the current crisis in South Africa, and then to link it both to Manosa's presentation on Krebs's work and mediations on Freud, as well as Stef Krebs's book, particularly Postcolonial Witnessing. So to begin with, I would say that as with the advent of the COVID pandemic, what the current situation has brought to bear, really the deeply seated chronic poverty under which the majority of South Africans live. And this has to do not only with systemic changes, but also with structural issues that, in as much as we speak about rainbowism and liberation or democracy, we have yet to address the issue of how to dismantle structures. And I'm speaking here about structures that malign certain people, particularly the Black and the poor in South Africa, and how we've just substituted the surface, the faces of the people in charge of these structures, and called that change, when in fact the deeper issues remain unaddressed. And I think we see a lot of that with the looting. Don't want to go too much into that. But I do want to address this idea of trauma and resilience, right? An idea of how, Stef, in your book, you speak about how trauma perpetrators and victims cannot lay claim to a sort of moral position due to where they're located on that spectrum, because trauma also involves a certain level of resilience. And I wondered if you could expand a bit more on what you conceive as the limits of this resilience. How much resilience can a person really have when they are stuck in conditions that keep them stuck, as is the case in South Africa, in the lived reality of a traumatic past. Secondly, and this is related to my previous point, or question rather, thinking about how societies, you cite in your book, are invested in wounded attachments, which is something that you quote from Wendy Brown. And I wondered if you could speak a bit more about this, this idea that, you know, in speaking about the traumatic, we risk overemphasizing wounded attachments, and whether this remains the case in post-conflict societies, where, as in South Africa, we've spoken a lot about our society being one with an atrophied conscience, and what that means essentially is that we are more susceptible to forgetting the past, to forgetting that the very nature of our attachments are characterized by woundedness, really. And then also you speak about how, and Manosa, you bring this up as well, about the tendency to speak about traumatic aesthetics, the aesthetics of trauma, which are theorized as being quite, you know, post-structuralist in nature. And it seems to me that it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, where you have representational modes emerging because we cannot quite get at a language that approximates any kind of articulation, at least within literature itself. And at the same time, then we theorize these representational processes in the theory. So which comes first? Is it the aesthetics emerging out of the fictional writing? Or is it the case that the fictional writing is writing in terms of these processes? And I wanted to address also this idea of you started off with Freud and this idea of love and inclination towards or for aggression. And I wonder what Freud means by people, because he very famously did not think that anyone who wasn't white and Western and male and part of the bourgeoisie was you know, included in this conception of people. And I think, Stef, your book, you speak about you speak about Fanon in particular, in terms of the the inclusion of the humanization of those with whom Freud would not have had contact or otherwise would not have conceived of in his conception of the human, really. And then to end off with, I have many questions. Okay, so the final question is really an invitation to expand a bit more on what Rajana Khanna, whom you cite in your book, who says that psychoanalysis itself is a colonial discipline that provides mechanisms for the critique of post-coloniality and neo-colonialism. And I wonder whether you agree with this position, what your own position in relation to the history of psychoanalysis itself, which, as we know, is quite contentious. So can we use a tool that had already excluded almost all of the world from its conception of the human and the psyche as a tool to speak about everyone else in the world? And I think I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much, Thando, for another inspiring and engaging response. Professor Stef Krebs, I'm going to invite you now to offer your response before we open it up for a conversation among us. And I must mention that we want to invite the members of the Trauma Studies group to have the first response and as part of the network, and we will open it up to the virtual audience out there. Thank you so much. Professor Stef Krebs.
Yes, hello, everyone. Before I answer any of these questions, I just want to say thank you to Pumla for the very kind introduction, and to Manosa for that generous and powerful presentation connecting my work to the state of the world, really, and South Africa, and to Thando also for those really penetrating insights and those very thoughtful questions. Lots of food for thought there. But thank you so much also for having me. It's really is a tremendous pleasure to join this community and to continue a conversation that started at a rather amazing symposium at Stellenbosch University on postcolonial legacies some 5 years ago, I think, which Pumla had kindly invited me to, and where I met all sorts of wonderful scholars. And I've had all sorts of interactions with Pumla, with other people, with other members of this group actually since then, and it gives me great joy to see all of you again and together today, even if only on a computer screen. I'm really impressed with the work that has sprung up in the context of the studies in historical trauma and transformation, and recent events, which Pumla and the other speakers already alluded to. I think demonstrate the enduring relevance of the kinds of questions that you are discussing. You've got something going here that's quite unique and quite wonderful, it seems to me, and I'm just really happy to be able to participate in it and to contribute to it in some small way. And I also wanted to say that I'm very pleasantly surprised by the high level of interest in this session. I honestly wasn't expecting that, so thank you all for watching, and I hope you get something out of this conversation, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Manosa and Thando already, put so much on the table that I honestly don't really know where to start, right? But Manosa, maybe one thing I could say is that I'm really glad that you noted in your presentation that in my work in postcoronal witnessing and beyond, I would say, I don't reject trauma theory outright. I think that's really, really important. For all my criticism of it, and rereading parts of the book in preparation for today, I was kind of struck by the critical tone of the book. You know, I mean, I wrote it, or parts of it, you know, almost 10 years ago, I think. And, you know, I guess if I were to do it all over again today, I might try to be a little more diplomatic in places. But, you know, overall, I do still, you know, stand by pretty much everything I said at the time. And so I'm glad you picked up on that, because I do indeed, you know, see myself as somebody who does who is obviously critical of trauma theory, but is not part of sort of the backlash against it, which we are seeing a lot of these days, right? There's this critic, Anne Roth, who in an article that she published, I think it was in 2016, it's called Irresponsible Nonsense. In that article, she makes what I thought was a useful distinction between external critiques and internal critiques of the field of trauma theory. And the first kind, external critiques, are delivered by people like Wolf Gansteiner, Ruth Lace, and Anne Roth herself. And the second kind by critics like me, Dominic Le Capra and Susanna Radstone. Those are, I think, the names that she mentions. And external critics, what she means by that is that these are people who do not partake in the discourse that they analyze. They reject it outright. And by contrast, internal critics seek to revise and to develop trauma theory from within. And so I think Roth is right to locate me in the latter group. My position is indeed one of appreciative but critical engagement rather than outright dismissal. So in my Postcriminal Witnessing book, I basically took trauma theory to task for its Eurocentric bias, as Manosa indicated, a bias that I think sits uneasily with the theory's globalizing thrust and its self-proclaimed ethical aspirations. The belief that trauma studies can contribute to the promotion of cross-cultural solidarity and the creation of new forms of community. I pointed out that this project is jeopardized by trauma theory's tendency to forget its situatedness and to assume universal validity for what are in fact local definitions and models. And I argued that the field needed to be globalized more fully and more responsibly. That's kind of the nutshell version of the argument in the book. So I developed a theoretical argument there, but then also devote a lot of time and attention to literary case studies, right, from across the world, English-speaking world. So that is really what the book is about. So I'm glad, Manosa, that you picked up on that. What else? You mentioned the health crisis. So you connected my work to sort of current affairs in South Africa, in the world at large. I haven't done any work, any actual work myself on the COVID-19 pandemic as a collective trauma or a cultural trauma. I noticed that it's often referred to in those terms, which I think is very interesting, really. Again, this is sort of my critical spirit, I suppose. I'm also a bit concerned by the ease with which that language of trauma is applied to the current pandemic, because things, I think, are not so straightforward. That language can illuminate, but it can also obscure things, the very inequalities that you talked about, Manosa. So, whether I think that the COVID-19 pandemic will actually result in a cultural trauma, it's too early to tell anyway, right? Because cultural traumas are usually studied in retrospect from a distant point in time. So think of war or genocide or slavery or terrorism and so on and so forth. And that temporal distance is necessary because it allows you to study what Jeffrey Alexander and Ron Ironman call the trauma process, the struggle over the meaning of the event as it plays out in a wide range of media, among politicians, journalists, artists, writers, and so on and so forth. And it allows you to determine the lasting impact on collective memory and identity. So collectives are traumatized in different ways than individuals. Collective consciousness does not function in quite the same way as the individual psyche. And that's, I think, a really important insight that we owe to sociologists like Alexander and Ironman. So we're not talking about the direct psychological impact of an event on individual members of a group. In order for an event to register as a collective trauma, it has to be constructed as such in the public sphere. So cultural discourses, political discourses, media discourses, they have to attribute traumatic status to the event for it to sort of be recognized, for it to be regarded as a collective trauma. It's because of that crucial role, actually, of representation, of mediation, of interpretation, that Alexander and Ironman prefer to speak of cultural trauma instead of collective trauma. Now, of course, the pandemic is still ongoing, right? It clearly is, you know, a major event that has negatively affected large numbers of people, most of the world's population. Even it's arguably, I think, even the first global event since the Second World War, and it has obviously had a significant, you know, psychological impact, has caused widespread anxiety and isolation. Many people have lost loved ones to COVID, many people have lost jobs, and so on and so forth. And so there's no question that the pandemic has had and continues to have a huge impact on people's lives. And so I certainly don't want to deny or minimize that in any way. But I am skeptical as to whether the pandemic will result in a cultural trauma as defined by Jeffrey Alexander and Ron Ironman, because historically pandemics have proved remarkably unmemorable. Take the Spanish flu, for example. The last global pandemic before COVID-19, the death toll of the Spanish flu is estimated to be higher than that of World War I and World War II combined. But even so, it's largely forgotten. It's left hardly any kind of mark on collective memory. There's hardly any high-profile memorials or museums, days of remembrance, novels, films, artworks, etc., that have been devoted to it. This is something that Laura Spinney points out in her book Pale Rider, which is a kind of, you know, history of the Spanish flu. And as a result, you know, we did not really learn any lessons from the Spanish flu, and as a result, you know, we're sort of woefully unprepared for COVID-19. But if the Spanish flu, which killed, you know, anywhere between 50 million and 100 million people, if that pandemic was almost completely forgotten, then why would COVID-19, you know, which has so far killed, you know, merely 4 million people, why would that pandemic be remembered, right? And I think one important reason why pandemics are so hard to remember, right, why they are not very memorable, apparently, is that they are hard to narrativize. And that's something that I think we've seen as well with, you know, the media and politicians trying to impose narrative templates on the pandemic derived from the Second World War in particular. When you know, back in March last year, you had political leaders like Trump, like Macron, like Boris Johnson and various other people using the language of war when talking about COVID-19. And, you know, that rhetoric didn't really catch on. It didn't really, you know, it hasn't really aged very well. At least I don't recall hearing it much, if at all, after the first few weeks or so. And I think that's because it didn't really fit very well, right? I mean, if COVID is a war, then who exactly is the enemy? Who exactly is the victim? It's kind of hard to say. You know, there is no human enemy, no human perpetrator, no particular individual or group that is responsible for the coronavirus outbreak. Though, of course, you know, some have undoubtedly helped make it worse than it should have been, or than it would otherwise have been. And it also very soon became clear, and I think this is what you were alluding to, Manosa, that we're not all in this together, right? We're not all victims. We may all be in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat, as the saying goes, right? So, I mean, COVID exacerbated existing socioeconomic disparities, especially along racial lines. I think it's no coincidence, actually, that a couple of months into the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests broke out in response to an incident of police violence in the US. You know, over the years, there have been plenty such incidents, but tensions were high in the spring of 2020 due to the racial injustices and racial inequalities that the pandemic had highlighted. And, you know, there's also the vastly uneven global distribution of COVID vaccines, which I don't need to tell you about in South Africa, right? Which has further emphasized that there is no homogeneous victim group. It's kind of hard to tell a simple moral tale about the pandemic. And you know, I actually suspect that the desire to designate COVID-19 as a cultural trauma or as a collective trauma, that is meant to obscure differences in the global distribution of vulnerability to the virus. Some groups are much more exposed than others, and the homogenizing language of trauma glosses over those kinds of differences and absolves us in the West, I would say, of the need to address them, right? So that's, I guess, why I'm sort of suspicious of that language and the ease with which it is used in relation to the current pandemic. Moreover, as I started out by saying, it's too soon anyway to call the pandemic a cultural trauma. Time will tell, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, do stop me if I'm going on, you know, because there's so much to say about all of the points that you raised. But let me just take a look at my notes, which I took while you were speaking, Manosa. Yeah, and this, I think, connects to Thando's question as well about Fanon, which I would really like to talk about. So Manosa mentioned, you know, the soldiers in the streets of South Africa, so current affairs in the country, which point to the persistence of the racialized inequalities of the past, as you put it, Manosa. So the sort of the unfulfilled promise, I guess, of trauma recovery post-apartheid. And I think Fanon's work is really instructive here. So I'm glad Thando brought this up specifically, and then sort of gives me a chance to talk about this. And Fanon, as sort of the way you framed it, Thando, was in relation to Freud. Freud's sort of very, you know, questionable take on the human and what is and is not included. And indeed, I have found the work of Frantz Fanon to be hugely inspiring. You know, his pioneering work on the psychological effects of racism and colonialism have really helped me conceptualize a model of trauma that is more capacious than the traditional individual and event-based model, a model that can account for and respond to collective, ongoing, everyday forms of traumatizing violence, right? Fanon anticipated the criticisms of the individualizing, psychologizing, pathologizing depoliticizing tendencies of the dominant trauma model that I and others were formulating about 10 years or so ago. And his work confirmed to me that I really was onto something, that it did in fact make a whole lot of sense to try to bring trauma studies and post-colonial or colonial realities into conversation, right? But there was something to be said for that. However, people did not tend to read Thando as a trauma theorist at the time. He wasn't recognized as such, which is why I felt it was important to hail him as a pioneer of post-colonial trauma theory, as Rebecca Saunders had already started doing. And I checked the index of my book, and he's really all over it. Thando is really, a very strong presence in the book. And in Black Skin, White Masks, there's this very famous and very memorable description of what we would call a microaggression these days, with Thando describing the devastating impact on his sense of himself, of encountering racial fear in a white child in France. So it's not just spectacular, extraordinary, catastrophic events that can cause trauma. Trauma can also result from an accumulation of such small everyday humiliations, indignities, slights, insults, and so on and so forth. And Thando also emphasizes the social nature of the traumas caused by racism, by colonialism. It doesn't make sense to treat them as individual problems, as psychoanalysis tended and tends to do. And moreover, and I think this is sort of the most relevant point for this discussion, Thando insisted on the need for material liberation, right? In and of itself, the talking cure does not suffice for him. So healing or recovery from racial or colonial trauma will not come from verbalizing one's traumatic experiences. The conditions which are political and socioeconomic in nature, the conditions that caused the trauma also have to be transformed for there to be genuine healing or recovery. And I think that point really resonates with what is going on, what has been going on in South Africa these days, right? So yeah, no, Thando I think is hugely relevant here, and I'm glad Thando asked about this, and Thando, you asked other really great questions about resilience, for example, right? The place of resilience. That is indeed a concept in which there is a lot of interest these days. Another one related concept is post-traumatic growth, right? Post-traumatic growth. So the idea being that if you suffer trauma, you are not destined or doomed to suffer only or to experience only negative effects. It can actually, there can be something good flowing from it. And you don't have to experience post-traumatic stress disorder necessarily. It can be an opportunity for growth. And so that is an idea that has attracted a lot of attention in recent years. And I think it's good that this point is made, that living through what we tend to refer to as traumatic events, but that's kind of a misnomer because no event is inherently traumatic, right? Events can have a traumatizing impact on some people, but not on others. So people can live through the same events without all of them being traumatized. Typically, it's only sort of a minority that actually goes on to develop post-traumatic symptoms. And I think, the emphasis on these concepts is welcome, is salutary to the extent that it highlights that, PTSD is not the only possible, is not an inevitable response to living through painful events or experiences, right? Having said that, I do think, again, this is my critical take on things coming through, I suppose, but I do think that these categories of resilience and post-traumatic growth are best approached with a skeptical eye, because they tend to, or they can be used to promote political quietism, they can be sort of depoliticizing. This is a point that Roger Luckhurst already made in his important book, The Trauma Question from 2008, I think it was, where he said that resilience is not really the basis for any form of cultural or political critique, right? I actually suspect that the current popularity of these concepts has much to do with their compatibility with classic bootstrap logic, with the logic of neoliberal capitalism, which I think Manosa also spoke about, right? At least in some accounts, right? So what that means is that the burden of success or failure is placed on the individual's character, and the traumatizing system is left off the hook, as it were, right? So the conditions that actually caused the painful events, the traumatic abuse, are obscured, are hidden from view, and the emphasis shifts to the individual who can sort of be made responsible for their own failure or not to overcome the experience, right? They should have shown more resilience somehow, right? So I'm a bit worried about that. Having said that, I don't think these concepts are necessarily destined to be depoliticizing and to be unthreatening to the established order. Attempts are actually being made to overcome some of these limitations by extending the theory to the collective level. It's usually applied to individuals only, but there are attempts being made to apply it to the collective level and to make it more culturally sensitive also, and foregrounding long-term structural as well as punctual forms of trauma. And I'm thinking of the work of Caroline Williamson-Sinalo, for example, or Hannah Grayson in relation to Rwanda, both of them. So I think this is a promising line of research, though I think we would be well advised to to maintain an element of skepticism. So yeah, resilience, wounded attachments, and the risk of overemphasizing wounded attachments. Very briefly, because I know I've been going on for a long time already, Thando. I refer to Wendy Brown's work on trauma in the conclusion, I seem to remember, to Postcoronal witnessing, where Wendy Brown sort of expresses her concern that there is indeed that risk that we become too focused on trauma, on wounded attachments, and that can sort of lead us away from a systemic critique of societal conditions, right? Similar points have been made by Lauren Berlant, the late Lauren Berlant, I should say, by John Mowitz, by various other people, Mark Seltzer, for example. So I think that is a risk that's very real. At the same time, and this is, again, my internal critique, I suppose. I wouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I like to believe that trauma is not, destined to only serve as a distraction from, the kind of systemic critique of societal conditions, which Wendy Brown, for example, thinks we should really be focusing on. I actually think it can serve as a kind of catalyst for precisely that. So very quickly, that's sort of my response to your question about wounded attachments. About aesthetics and sort of which comes first, trauma theory or these aesthetic categories, that's, I think, a really interesting question, which Alan Gibbs has done much to illuminate in his book from 2014. I think it was Contemporary American Trauma Narratives, where he formulates this scathing critique of the sort of seemingly unconventional you know, conventions of what he calls the trauma genre, right? So the trauma genre is a kind of writing which actually takes its inspiration from trauma theory, which, you know, by the early years of this century had sort of become fairly well established. And he sort of suspects that indeed there are writers out there who borrow ideas from the theory to then apply them in their own creative work, right? And he says, you know, I mean, the idea that trauma is, you know, is basically a kind of crisis of meaning, a failure of understanding, and it had best be represented through a failure of representation. So through fragmented, non-linear, anti-narrative forms, you know, modernist or postmodern literary techniques, experimentalism, avant-garde forms. That's sort of an axiom that sort of existed in early trauma or literary trauma theory, I should say. And he's very skeptical about this and says, you know, there's a kind of feedback loop between writers and theorists, because writers sort of apply these ideas from the theory, and then theorists or trauma critics, they see their assumptions about what, you know, valuable trauma literature is and should be like. They see that confirmed in that body of writing, and there's a kind of, you know, unhealthy, somewhat incestuous relationship between the two. So I thought that was very interesting, right? There's a lot more to say about this, but I think I'm going to stop here. We can always, you know, if you want to pursue this, Thando, feel free to mention that, but otherwise I'm going to be taking up far too much time. As for my position on you know, the history of psychoanalysis as a colonial discipline, and can we still use it as a tool for, you know, liberation, if you like, even though it has these tainted origins? I think my answer would be yes. I should devote a section of postcolonial witnessing to this question about tainted origins of the sort of the main methodologies that literary trauma theory uses, right? So trauma theory is I think, usefully conceptualized as a kind of marriage between psychoanalysis and deconstruction. You know, I mean, that's sort of literary trauma theory as envisaged, as developed by people like Kathy Carruth, Shoshana Fellman, and Jeffrey Hartman in the early to mid 1990s, right? So it really is about combining a psychoanalytic theory of trauma with a deconstructive vigilance regarding the indeterminacies of representation. And in the book, I sort of look into the various critiques that people have leveled at both psychoanalysis and deconstruction, or post-structuralism more broadly, because indeed both of these fields have been accused of Eurocentrism, of being sort of irredeemably you know, tainted by their often, you know, Eurocentric origins. And I, again, you know, not wanting to throw out the baby with the bathwater, I do think that these fields can actually be redeemed, which is a point that, I mean, it's not just me saying that, but, you know, you mentioned Kama, indeed, in her book. There's Christopher Lane as well. There's, you know, quite a few people, and there's, you know, there's Fanon, of course, whom I've already talked about. So I don't think you need to be, that you don't have to sort of reject or dismiss theoretical or conceptual frameworks outright because they originated in a particular place or time, and they have all this baggage. You know, I like to believe that it doesn't really work that way, that you can actually use, you know, the master's tools to destroy the master's house, to use that famous phrase. Okay, there's a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop here, otherwise I'm going to be going on forever. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Stef. We have about 23 minutes for Q&A. But I'm glad about all your comments, but especially the final one, that we need to infuse the field of psychoanalysis with new thinking. And that is how we enrich knowledge and scholarship, not to throw it out, but to see what we can use and how we infuse it, in a way, disrupt it, so to speak. So I think there's plenty of invitation and from all of you around that. I don't want to, I've got some questions, but hopefully there'll be time. I do want to give a chance to Thando to point out for us who has some questions, and I can jump in, when there's a gap.
We've got a few questions, some of which have been answered by Prof. Krabs through his presentation and his responses. So
Okay.
First of all, we'll take any questions from the Trauma Studies group.
Can you give Manosa a chance to just say, a quick response back to Professor Krabs, and then we open it up. Can you do that, Manosa?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Prof, for the responses. They were quite thorough. Just on psychoanalysis, and it's very interesting in my head to think that the people that I've been thinking with, let's say Freud and Nelson Mandela, who happen to be sort of, and I argue in my mind that it's probably the best position to be in, because it means that you are thinking and you are struggling with, with the world and with people's views and so forth. But on the point of psychoanalysis and its use, I think for me personally, what it raises up is a question about theory. What is theory and how is it created, right? How is it crafted? Because I remember, for instance, in my second year lecture in literary studies, hearing of the concept of the conscious and the unconscious, and immediately thinking that I'd always thought that was the case. I'd always thought that we are beyond ourselves, that we always, right, that there are things that haunt us that we are unaware of. And I just did not have the language for it. And of course, went on to read more Freud, the id, the ego, the superego. And I kept saying, this is exactly it. In other words, it seemed, in my narcissistic mind, it often seems to me that what Freud was able to point out or to create as psychoanalysis are questions that I'd already been dealing with in my teenage years and so forth, and just needed a language to illuminate it. Therefore, once again, raising the question of what is theory? Is it theory because it's written down and you study it at university and and so forth, or are we in fact, right, I don't know, in a simplified way, are we all just walking theoretical machines that are trying to make sense of the world? So that is where I would put the question of psychoanalysis. And of course, not at all what you call it, not at all dismiss, the history of some of the things that Freud said about other races, specifically the Black race and so forth. But what is interesting to me, of course, and I think many theorists have pointed this out, is that oftentimes when you read theorists or novelists or any even our everyday encounters, you have to also have the capacity to read people against themselves. Sort of say, oh, you're saying that these people are inferior, and you say that human beings are internally aggressive. That's exactly it. Like, that's precisely why you cannot see that other people are human, precisely because there's some aggression working in Freud. Therefore you read him against himself, almost pull a rug under his feet to expose his limits, but at the same time to show how he might have been blind to the very profound insights that he gave to the world. So that's my approach as opposed to the world, and to these sort of things.
I totally second that, Manosa.
Thando, over to you. Thank you very much, Manosa.
Thanks. So I'm going to start off with a question from Emile Diouf. I'm sorry if I'm like butchering your name. And it goes, I was just wondering whether the pandemic has not in some ways challenged us to think about the temporality of the trauma process. Where might we fetch the language to conceptualize pain as it unfolds? Can we afford to think of trauma in its belatedness in the midst of this pandemic and resulting disparities? And I think that's for you, Prof. Krabs.
Yeah, yeah, this sort of goes back to what I was saying about it sort of being too soon to tell whether the COVID-19 pandemic will result in a cultural trauma. I guess what I was talking about is the specific notion of cultural trauma, right? Collective trauma. But there is no denying, of course, that the pandemic is having a huge psychological impact on lots of people around the world, right? I guess, you know, it depends on the definition of trauma, right? When you and the lens through which you approach it. It's a very capacious concept, and the sociologists that I mentioned, so Jeffrey Alexander von Eiermann, there's also Kai Erikson, or Arthur Neal, who have worked on this. They tend to see trauma as a social construction, right, and sort of sever the link between the psychological realm and the sociological realm altogether. Trauma is whatever comes out of this trauma process, which is a discursive process, a kind of struggle over the meaning of the event that sort of plays out in the public sphere. If you adopt that definition, then you do have to sort of wait and see what is going to stick, right, in terms of that, what comes out of that discursive struggle really over the meaning. And it's kind of early to tell. But again, if you approach trauma as a psychological reality first and foremost, then it would be hard to deny that trauma, or that the pandemic is having that kind of impact on lots of people around the world right now. Absolutely. And what does it mean to to think about trauma when you're in the midst of it? I think is a really interesting question. And again, I think it's difficult because we do tend to consider, also if you look at the conceptualization of post-traumatic stress disorder, temporal distance is kind of built into those conceptions, right? And when you're sort of still in the midst of it, it's sort of, it's difficult to make sense of, or to name it that, because it doesn't quite tick that box, at least. So yeah, I feel like I'm rambling here, but I think it's a really interesting point, and I'm glad to the question for bringing it up.
Thank you, Prof. Here's another interesting one from Ayanda Nyoka, who says, thank you so much, Prof. Stef. I'm working through trauma narratives of Black South African Pentecostal women, and it's interesting to see the themes of resilience and post-traumatic growth coming through in their narratives, which are very much connected to their religious experience, and in brackets, the God factor. Do you perhaps have any thoughts about the role of spirituality in how we can theorize trauma, especially in African contexts where spirituality seem how as Africans we construct meaning about our lives? Do you perhaps have any thoughts about the role of spirituality and how we can theorize trauma, especially in African contexts where spirituality seems to be how, as Africans, we construct meaning about our lives?
Thank you for that. That's another really key question, I think. And I guess I should say, you know, about sort of limitations of my own work, because the short answer is I don't really go into this very much. You know, I've tended to focus in my work, postcolonial witnessing, but also in essays I've written afterwards on literary texts that highlight the shortcomings of the dominant trauma discourse, right? For example, Sindiwe Magoana's Mother to Mother, Aminata Forna's The Memory of Love, which are texts by postcolonial writers, however, writers who are steeped in Western culture, who write in English, who address a Western audience first and foremost, and they invest considerable, you know, energy in pointing out the inappropriateness, the injustice of applying Western frameworks to, you know, a colonial or post-colonial situation, but they are less concerned with offering a concrete alternative. So I think, you know, we seem to have entered a new phase in trauma scholarship, thanks to the fact that, you know, the post-colonial turn, which, you know, my work helped initiate, is well underway now. And now that the critique part has been taken care of, as it were, and that's sort of where I situate my own work for the most part. Now that that's sort of been taken care of, people are starting to examine what an alternative to that dominant trauma discourse might look like, you know, in practice, on the ground, in particular non-Western or minority contexts. And it's been, you know, very gratifying to see that my work has sort of been taken up by other scholars, including PhD students who are doing just that, right? So I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Ryan Topper and Jay Rajiva. And I think their scholarship is really relevant in terms of the role of spirituality or animism in African trauma literature. So I would really recommend that the questioner, whose name escapes me, sorry, would check out Ryan Topper's and Jay Rajiva's work. But there's other people like, you know, Jennifer Yusin or Adebayo and Thando, you yourself, of course. And there's this collection, Post-Conflict Hauntings, that Pumla recently co-edited together with Jeffrey Prager and Kim Whale. So I think it's important to study how the cultural production of particular non-Western or minority groups bears witness to painful histories, and that requires specialized knowledge of these other cultures and languages, of the different media, different forms of expression that they use, and also indeed of local beliefs about suffering, about healing. So I think that's where we are now, and I think the people that I've mentioned are doing really interesting and important work in this area right now.
Thank you so much, Prof. Prof. Pumla has a comment, question.
Thank you very much, Thando. You know, I wonder about the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it doesn't offer us an opportunity to reflect and rethink on what traumatic experience means. And I wonder whether, in fact, part of the challenge is that it doesn't happen at a place. It's not like a war, a site of war, a massacre, or, you know, a particularly physically obvious, you know, and visible to everyone experience. I wonder whether the fact that it's kind of pervasive, you know, it's a disease, it goes through it, you know, the world. And I especially thinking about us, our situation here, there's very much of a layering of trauma. I mean, just think about the mourning itself, just the experience of mourning, or actually the absence or the inability to mourn, where people are buried without the usual rituals that allow people to mourn and to work through the traumas that they experience. That it seems to me that COVID, the pandemic, might be, particularly in this context where we are witnessing the dramas of suffering really playing out, both in terms of what Manosa so profoundly described is what is happening in communities here, and the history of the suffering, you know, laying over what is happening at the moment. And so it's almost like we have the integration of all these experiences that allow us an opportunity to think about what does it mean to experience trauma, not in the way that psychoanalysis says it happens, but rather in a way that forces us to reflect on, you know, what are the consequences of this catastrophe, because it is a catastrophe. When people are dying, they are, you know, the graves are increasing. You cannot be with your loved one. So there's something unfinished. And if you think about the whole idea of trauma in its original description as something that is unfinished, right? If you think about the enslavement period, for instance, where people were confronted with the total helplessness, you know, I'm a slave, I'm treated the way I'm treated, I have no power, I have no way of responding to this. And then there's a next generation, it was not dealt with. And so that unfinished business, that task, as Freud calls it, is the task that is facing the subsequent generations. What is the task that is going to face the generations that come after the pandemic, given that it too is something that is unfinished, something that has not been dealt with because of the nature of the way that it happens. So I just wonder really whether, you know, we shouldn't shy away from, you know, opening ourselves up to the possibility that it might be a trauma, precisely because of, you know, the state of just total lack of control and helplessness and being unable to mourn, you know, until, you know, you've got, it's almost as if you have, it's a kind of trauma that is an absence, you know, which makes it even more difficult to mourn and therefore more difficult to work through the trauma.
That's really interesting, Pumla. And I think definitely at the level of the family, I think, you know, the experiences that many of us are having, all of us are having right now, but of course, in different ways, will be passed down to the next generations. I think, you know, and also especially young people, you know, there's no question that this is going to be sort of a generational memory for people who are sort of, you know, graduating secondary school, university. These are sort of the experiences you have at that time in your life tend to be sort of most impactful. And so, you know, the inability to mourn, yeah, these stories, of course, that we're seeing are sort of heartbreaking, and it's kind of hard to imagine that this would not have sort of a lasting impact on individuals to be passed down to sort of the next generation or generations even. I think that's different though from the question as to whether whether we will sort of look back on COVID-19 as a cultural trauma, right? To stick with that as a collective trauma at the level of the nation state, or as sort of a global experience. So beyond the family, because I think, you know, the Spanish flu as well, you know, lived on in family memory for several generations, but not so much at the level of the state, right? In terms of sort of official commemorative ceremonies or practices, it seemed to be largely absent. And I have a feeling it might actually end up being, I mean, there's the precedence of the Spanish flu that I mentioned, but also, you know, it might be overshadowed by other political or economic disasters that are still in store, and which might actually be precipitated or caused to some extent by the pandemic, right? which is, part of the reason also why the Spanish flu has sort of disappeared from collective memory, is that it was sort of overshadowed by the world wars, right, which sort of seemed to be more pressing and which were easier to narrativize as well. But yeah, time will tell, I suppose.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think we're heading towards the end of our time. We're supposed to end at past. So I wonder if you could take one last question, and this one is addressed to Manosa. It's from Lerato Machetela. My question for you, Manosa, regarding your view on aggression towards the other versus love for something else. What is your take on aggression as a pre-symbolic form of preservation of the self and reflecting boiling concerns over survival?
Thank you, Lerato. I suppose I would think of it in these ways, and I would borrow from Freud, of course, which is that for Freud, society and individuals are divided within themselves. Society is divided within itself. As people, we are divided within ourselves. Therefore, there can never be, a cohesion that one could form that, would be a utopia that one would live in. As we all know, of course, we live with great differences in our societies. Let me make an example, for instance, as that, living in South Africa, there's the, let's say, black-white dynamic, which we know about. Then there's the tribalistic dynamics, which we know about. But then when I go back to my tribe again, there are also differences within the tribe as well. And then you go to the family, mother and father and children are fighting. Therefore, this notion that aggression could be seen or perceived as an attempt to protect oneself is in a way always naive, because there's always something to be up against. And that's something that, I don't think that's something that can be escaped, right? You can put a group, group of people can isolate themselves from everyone and create their own society, but no sooner or later divisions will form within them. So I would say because of that, I would be less inclined to sort of, go with the view that we are, that we are protecting ourselves when we are being aggressive and we choose to be with the ones that we love, because even within the terrain of the ones that we love, no sooner do you find divisions within that. So I suppose I'm still trying to figure out exactly how you work towards, right, living with difference, understanding its great consequences, but at the same time, accepting that you cannot do without it, that it will always be a feature of life. Therefore, I would not be pro sort of saying, yes, we need to protect ourselves because the world is aggressive, because it's always aggressive from where you stand as an individual within yourself. We are, as we all know, we are divided within ourselves.
Thank you so much, Manosa. And for those of you attending, in the chat, Unison has kindly put up the link for where you can access the session via the Stellenbosch University website. So if you want to just make a note of that, it's in the chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Thando, for managing that. It's always a difficult challenge to know which questions to ask. And thank you to our speakers today. Thanks to you all for attending this afternoon's conversation. We look forward to seeing you back. Our next trauma studies conversation is with Michael Rothberg on 25th of August. Before then, we're going to have a conversation on a book written on women prisoners in South Africa. So looking very much forward to all of that. Thank you again to you both, Manosa and Stef. And thank you so much, Thando, for holding it all together. I want also to thank our trauma studies group. In fact, the person who asked the question, Lirato Machetela, she's part of the trauma studies group. We also have the two people who will be in conversation with Michael Rothberg, members of the trauma studies group, Adibayo Sakiru, and Adam Levine, who are also part of the network. Refilwe is also here. I see her. She will be managing the Q&A on that day. So thank you so much, everyone. And Stef, please come back. We are opening up now. We hope to see you in person in South Africa and in Stellenbosch. So thank you to our backroom manager, Unison Mugamu. We appreciate your management of this process. Thank you so much. Don't go away, the four of you, please. Everyone, goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a total pleasure.